Okay, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. I'm Jay Warmke with solarpvtraining.com. And our normal routine here that we're going to go through is going to go through the various news of the week in the world of solar, and then hit some of the highlights about webinars, conferences, events that are coming up. And then we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive. Today's topic is looking at affordability state by state. Because there's a lot of variables that determine whether or not solar is affordable. Not only the cost of installation, but also what is the average utility rate within that jurisdiction. And that's probably the biggest determinants, as you'll find out. So let's go ahead and jump in to the news of the week for the week of September 8th. The Biden administration took a couple of actions in the last week or so that really indicate, I'm just realizing I need to switch my view. There we go. That indicate a real commitment to rural solar at the utility scale level in America. The first one was the U.S. Bureau of Land Management issued its updated Western Solar Plan last Thursday, and they increase the amount of federal lands that are going to be available or open to the development of utility solar. In the original plan, they had set aside 22 million acres as being suitable for utility scale solar development. Now they've increased that to 31 million acres, so an increase of 9 million acres. Now, under this plan, developers can bid on sites that are located within 15 miles of existing transmission lines or proposed transmission lines, as long as these sites are not considered sensitive wildlife habitat or sensitive cultural locations. Now, solar energy advocates have praised this expansion of availability of solar on public lands, although they do point out that the current BLM policy allows for 80 million acres to go for the development of fossil fuels, so about 2.5 times that's been allocated for soil. So we make progress, but never quite as much as the fossil fuel industry, unfortunately. The Biden administration also announced that it's awarding $7.3 billion in grants and low interest loans to about 16 rural energy co-ops serving 23 different states. These funds represent, according to the White House, the largest investment in rural electrification by the federal government since the Franklin Roosevelt administration. The utilities that are going to receive these funds, and I thought I'd list these out because it's interesting if your utility happens to fall in there. Dairyland Electric in Wisconsin, Tri-State Generation and Transmission, Colorado, Nebraska, New Mexico, and Wyoming. Seminole Electric in Florida, Allegheny Electric in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, Arizona Electric Power Cooperative, Basin Electric Power Co-op in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Nebraska, and Wyoming. Buckeye Power, that's ours here in Ohio. Core Electric Cooperative in Colorado. Eastern Kentucky Power Cooperative. Golden Valley Electric Association in Alaska. Great River Energy in Minnesota. Minn Kota Power Cooperative in Minnesota and North Dakota. San Miguel Electric Cooperative in Texas, and Wolverine Supply Cooperative in, of course, Michigan. Globally, solar installations grew by a staggering 76% in 2023, adding over 428 gigawatts of solar capacity worldwide. Now, to put this in perspective, basically last year, more solar was installed than existed on the planet 6 years ago. So according to the International Energy Agency, the IEA, utility scale solar is now the cheapest option for electric generation in most nations around the world, which of course accounts for this increase, this spike. And another factor in there is that the cost of solar panels have come down to their lowest level ever. The average cost per watt for a solar panel around the globe is actually 11 cents per watt. Now, that's 1/3 the cost that we pay here in the United States. The average cost here in the US is 31 cents per watt. The prices for solar panels here in the US are about 3 times what other countries are paying, largely because of the tariffs that have been placed on the panels coming in from China, as well as some of the other Southeast Asian nations. A new report by Bloomberg NEF states that for the first time, more than 40% of all of the global electricity is being produced through non-carbon sources as of 2023. This little graphic, which I thought was kind of cute. Hydropower accounted for 14.9% worldwide. Wind and solar, a little bit over 14%. Nuclear at 9.2%, still considered carbon-free, of course. According to the report, wind and solar represented nearly 91% of all of the new generating capacity that was added to the grid in 2023. Now, this is up from 83% in 2022. And oil and gas, or not oil and gas, coal and natural gas represented just 6% of all of the new build generating capacity worldwide, which is the lowest percentage ever. So we've obviously seen a transition to renewable, not just here in America, but worldwide. In fact, in many respects, America is behind the curve. Speaking of which, China accounts now for about 1/3 of all of the renewable energy that's used on planet Earth. And the top 10 nations account for about 3/4. So it's not a uniform kind of adoption. So 3/4 of all the renewable energy can be found in these 10 countries. China, number 1. US is number 2. Brazil, number 3. Canada, followed by India. Germany, Japan, Russia, Norway, and Turkey. So a couple in there that you wouldn't imagine. Construction is underway on an 800 megawatt solar project in southern Illinois, which the developer Swift Current Energy is describing as the largest U.S. solar project located east of the Mississippi. The project involves the installation of about 1.6 million solar panels mounted on solar trackers, which is pretty normal for these utility scale systems. Now, these solar trackers are typically east-west oriented, will follow the sun throughout the day, and generate about 30% more than a fixed mount solar system. The project is anticipated will generate employment for about 435 craft workers. Yeah, Pete, you had a question there? Jump on in.
Yeah, here they're oriented north-south. In Wisconsin, these tracking axes are oriented north to south, about a north-south axis as they track east to west.
Yeah. You're right. I'm talking about the panels will face east-west. Yeah, so the racking system is north-south. Yeah, so that in the morning the panels are facing the east, and then at noon they'd be laying flat, and then in the afternoon. Yeah, yep. So you're right. So this particular project, about 435 people are going to be working on it. They're anticipating that workforce will be there for about 14 months. The renewable energy generated from this project, called the Double Black Diamond Solar Project, which is a bit of a weird name, is set to be used. There's some power purchase agreements by Chicago O'Hare Airport and Loyola University up there in Chicago. The project is slated to come online and begin commercial operations in 2025. And those are the headlines from this past week. Does anybody have anything they want to add to that mix here before we jump into the webinars and the like? Give you just a second there. All right, feel free to jump in at any point throughout this. One of the nice things about, I think, this format is that because there are folks online, we can get a bit of an interactive activity going on. This week is the big RE Plus conference out in Anaheim, California. It runs from September 9th, which is yesterday, as of this recording, through the 12th. So if you're not there, you're probably not going there. September 17th, there's a session Let me increase the size of this. At noon, and it's on permitting and inspection. Then September 19th at 2 p.m., third-party ownership, TPO, about optimizing your systems when there is a third-party owner. September 25th at 2 p.m., digital tools for the energy transition coming on. These are all free webinars. The 25th also at 2 p.m., SunGrow CCI, which is commercial, community solar and industrial. So basically larger systems, except not utility scale systems, energy storage solutions for those. And then, of course, we have online and in-person courses at solarpvtraining.com. And I'll shamelessly plug the fact that our 9th edition of Understanding Photovoltaics coming out as we speak. So if you're interested in that, just let me know. And that is the latest as far as the webinars and the like for the industry. Anybody else have anything there that they want to add into that mix? All right. Okay, well, hopefully we'll get a bit of feedback as we go through these. Just how much I wanted to do a state-by-state evaluation of the affordability of solar. There was a recent report by Forbes where they did some number crunching, although I did find a couple of false assumptions within these numbers, which kind of surprised me that Forbes would be so far off on it. I'll try and explain what I ran into when I was doing these numbers. But to back up just a little bit, when we talk about affordability of solar, we're typically talking about numbers that, at least in my experience, Energy Sage publishes their report every year, and they come up with these averages. Today, the average size, 10.8 kW for a system. The average price for installation, $2.75 per watt, according to Energy Sage, which gives you an average cost of $29,700. That's pre-incentives with a range, as I put here, and then after tax credits of 30% for these residential systems. It's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $21,000. So that's where we get our numbers, but that only tells a little part of the story, because averages are very misleading when it comes to finances, especially. I always like to say, on average, Bill Gates and I are very, very wealthy, but that doesn't really give you the story, right? So, it varies a bit. Some of the factors that are going to have a significant impact on this is the installation cost. What is the rate per watt for installation? And it does vary by as much as $1 a watt across the US, within averages on the various states. The biggest, and the thing that I don't think most folks really internalize when they're talking about affordability of solar, is what is the cost of electricity in that jurisdiction? That is really the determining factor as to how affordable solar is in your location. I've had discussions with different utility folks who are kind of upset about solar eating into their world. And I said, well, you know what, you can stop that just by lowering your rates. If you lower your rates, solar becomes less affordable. So if you really are concerned about competition, how about making your product more affordable? They don't like that, but strangely. And then what's the size of the system needed? Well, in this comparison, what we've done, and I do realize that, like in any comparison here, there are a number of assumptions that kind of makes the data a little bit suspect. But I think if we drill down on it, it's helpful. It's helpful to compare apples to apples a little bit. So I'm making an assumption of 4.5 hours of insolation at these locations. Now, obviously, if you're in Phoenix, Arizona, you're going to get a bit more insolation on an average day versus Portland, Oregon. But as a good national average, I figure about 4.5 hours of insolation, which then for a 6 kW system, which is what we're comparing here, you're going to get about 9,855 kilowatt hours of annual production. If I did my math right, I hope I did. Now, I'm also making an assumption on retail net metering, because trying to factor in all the different, this one pays you wholesale, this one pays you better than wholesale, this one pays you retail, impossible, because it really is on a utility by utility basis. We could spend a lot of time and try and drill down a little bit closer. But again, I know that it gives us some false figures in some states, but not terribly false. So then what we did is we basically said, all right, here's the net cost. So cost of your system after your 30% tax credit, divided by the cost of electricity in that state times the cost of installation, or times production. So basically, what is the value of the electricity that's been produced? And that's going to give us a payback period. All right, so just to reiterate that, we're going to take the net cost and divide it by the savings in electricity for that year. And that's going to give us a payback period. Hopefully everybody agrees on that. If not, then this whole thing is out the window. Okay, so let's do them in reverse order. What's the worst state for solar as far as affordability? Well, Nebraska. And the payback period for a system in Nebraska is 11.73 years. Well, what is the reason for this? Because it's not overly expensive to install solar. It's just the electricity is very inexpensive in in Nebraska. So, the cheaper the electricity, the longer is going to be the payback. So it's not necessarily a bad thing for the folks living in Nebraska. It's just that they have the benefit of low cost electricity. And as I was looking at this, it occurred to me that we're seeing some dramatic increases in electrical costs, largely because of the increase in fossil fuel costs, as well as the increase in demand for electricity as we're electrifying vehicles, and we're seeing data centers taking more, and Bitcoin and all these other. So we're seeing a bit of a hockey stick curve for demand that's coming forward. So I really do feel that we're going to see escalation of electric prices. Really, within a couple of years, we may even see doubling of electric prices. That's not beyond the realm of possibility. Well, as that happens, then the affordability of solar just increases, because solar tends to decrease in price, electricity tends to increase in price. So all of these trends are just going to accelerate, and the utilities are going to have a fit and blame environmentalists, right? Okay, so number 50 is Washington State. Washington State, again, 11.11 years payback. And once again, it's really a factor of low-cost electricity. Here, of course, they get quite a lot from hydro. Number 49 is Idaho. And Idaho, again, is benefiting from low-cost electricity. Louisiana, cheap electricity and actually cheap installation costs as well, but it comes in at 48th as far as the payback on this. And as these states start to roll out, you'll begin, hopefully, at least it occurred to me as I was doing this, to begin to see why solar is not popular in those states, not as popular as we see it in other states. It really becomes a matter of simple economics. If the cost is not, if the benefit's not there, if the payback is more than 10 years, why would you invest that kind of money in solar? Missouri, 10.5 years almost. Again, 11.5 cents for electric costs. And this kind of demonstrates with the low cost in some of these states, like in Utah, where electricity is below 11 cents kilowatt hour. When we start hearing that the national average is 16, 17, 18 cents a kilowatt hour, it really does demonstrate that there's quite a disparity between a lot of these states, where some states are dealing with, 10.5, 11 cents. Other states, as you're going to see, are up there in the 30, 40, even 50 cent a kilowatt hour rate. Okay, 45. Number 45 is Iowa, payback of 10.31 years. Tennessee has inexpensive, largely because of the Tennessee Valley Authority. So there's a slow payback on that, 10.21 years. Arkansas comes in at 43. And North Dakota, now I highlighted some of these things like in green here, 10.5 cents a kilowatt hour. North Dakota comes in with the cheapest electricity on a state-by-state basis. It has just under 10 years payback. So the annual savings is going to come in at the lowest. And actually the cost for installation is pretty low as well, $2.24. But the cost of electricity is just so low that the payback is a bit out of reach for a lot of people. Oklahoma comes in at 41, and Wyoming, so a lot of these Western states, 9.77 years. Indiana comes in at a payback of 9.5 years. Now their price per is still pretty starting to get closer to the average, 14 cents and some change, but their cost of installation is pretty high. 2.87 cents, $2.87. Montana, 9.39 years payback, again, low cost of energy. Minnesota, they also have some low cost energy, but 9.4, so we're in the 30s still. Georgia, payback 9.12. And Kentucky comes in at 35 at just over 9 years. And again, this was kind of interesting to me as I'm looking at some of these 9 and 10 year, because sitting here in Ohio, typically I'll tell customers the payback is in the 7-year range. And I was a little bit surprised that many of these states, you know, it's substantially higher than that. Virginia, 8.8. We're getting into a little bit more expensive electricity, still relatively inexpensive. South Dakota comes in at 33. Oregon, again, up there in the hydro world, lower cost, 14.23 cents per kilowatt hour. Mississippi, 8.74 years. I was actually surprised that it was that short a time period. I was thinking it would probably be a little more like Louisiana. New Mexico, 8.66. And Colorado at 8.61 years for the payback. West Virginia comes in at 28 with about 8.5 years for their payback. Their electricity is relatively expensive comparatively. I think you'll find in a lot of these states where they sort of are all in on coal, because of the coal escalation of price, you're seeing higher and higher electric costs. Illinois, and of course this is devoid of any of the incentives that are part of their special program there. It's about 8.5 years for the payback there. Kansas comes in at 26. And we're just coming halfway through. South Carolina comes in at 8.23. I'm going through these relatively quickly. If you want to, expound on any of them, let me know. 24th was Texas. This surprised me because Texas is such a big state for solar, but I really feel like a lot of that is utility scale solar. So most of what we're dealing with here really focuses on residential solar. So it may scale, it may make a lot of sense at the utility scale, but Texas is just mid-range when it comes to residential solar. Florida comes in at number 23 with a payback of about 7.8. And I'm assuming, now this is the numbers that I got from Forbes, electric cost of 15.28 cents per kilowatt hour. I know Siggy was on the call here. Siggy, is that a relatively
Yeah,
good number?
that's pretty accurate. That's about what I pay, but it includes all the taxes and fees and surcharges, and they are very creative when it comes to adding fees and taxes on top of it. But yeah, that's about what I pay.
Okay, we're probably still paying for the Spanish-American War and things like that as part of
They have a renewable energy development charge or something like that. It's like $5-6 a month or so. I think they're charging me to build solar somewhere.
Yeah, I see that on most bills. There is one of those, and I think they originally put that in there because they were claiming that there was a cost involved in transitioning to renewable energy, so they want to pass that along. I don't know.
I don't know either.
Yeah, the joke I always think about with these kind of things was when I was in telecommunications, there literally was a tax on your telephone bill to pay for the Spanish-American War, and it was in place until the 1990s. They had paid for that war about 100 times over, but they were still collecting it because they considered telephones at the time to be quite an extravagant luxury. So it was kind of a luxury tax to pay for a war. So,
All right.
yeah, why not? All right. So North Carolina comes in 22nd, 15 cents kilowatt hour, $2.50. I guess I should note too, some of these per watt numbers that I was looking at here, these come from Forbes. They're a little bit higher than the ones that you see from Energy Sage. So take that for what it's worth. Yeah, and in the chat asking size, and basically, yes, I'm doing this for 6 kW systems at every location. Another of the assumptions is that they will in fact use all of the power that's being generated from this array. So otherwise you wouldn't put that in. You would make it smaller. So just an apples to apples comparison. Number 20 is Wisconsin, payback of about 7.7 years on this. And again, everything is very site specific. So we're making a lot of assumptions here. Arizona, number 20, 7.5 years. Ohio always loves to be in the middle. We don't want to be number 1 or number 50. So we're very comfortable somewhere mid-range. So in this case, 7.4 years for the payback there. And I think the 15.77, about 16 cents a kilowatt hour, is pretty reflective. So those numbers seem pretty good. Delaware, now we're starting to get into some higher prices for electricity. Michigan, number 17, a little over 7 years payback, and now we're up to 18.5 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity. Pennsylvania, 7.29. So there's Washington, D.C. I was surprised that it wasn't a little more affordable. Of course, they've got some very high cost RECs, but their electricity is relatively expensive there. Number 14 is Maryland. I'm going to try and get predictions here when we get into the top 10. So I would guess, I'll give you a little hint. I think number 1 and number 2 are pretty easy to guess. The rest of them may not be so easy. So number 13, and this really surprised me, Alabama. You would think as far as an affordability index, Alabama should be a wash in solar. The payback is pretty high, pretty quick, 7.14. Yep, I'm seeing some guesses for number 1 and number 2, and I will say in the chat anyway, and they're right. So New Jersey, number 12. Actually, when we did the thing about policies, New Jersey came in number 1 on policies. Number 12 on affordability at just right at 7 years. Now we've broken the 7-year. Nevada comes in 11th with 6.54. Relatively high cost electricity there. But low cost solar for sure. And number 10, okay, I should have let you guess here, but anybody want to guess? Vermont comes in at number 10. Anybody got a guess for, we'll get a couple of guesses here for others in the top 10. And we've already had the guess that Hawaii and California are number 1 and number 2. Somebody's guessing New York. We'll see. Anybody else? Yeah, just come up with the states that we haven't mentioned yet, right? And Maine. Okay, that's good. So, all right, number 9, New Hampshire. No, I'm afraid we just did DC. Number 9 is New Hampshire. Yeah, 5.9. Now, as you can see, the cost per watt is pretty expensive at $3 a watt, basically $2.99. But the cost of electricity is very high, 23.76. So again, I just want to reemphasize that it really is the cost of electricity that's the driver on affordability of solar. The more expensive electricity gets, the faster the payoff on solar. All other things being equal, of course. New York, which was guessed there, comes in at 5.48. I am getting a guess on New Jersey. I think they might be next. Maine, number 7, 5.4. And you can see we're up around 25 cents per kilowatt hour. And Massachusetts comes in at number 6. And I highlighted this because this is the highest cost of installation of any of the states in the country. No idea why that is, except I guess maybe, well, there are other high cost of living areas, but $3.29 a watt for installation. So that in combination with very high electric costs comes in with about 5.25 years payback. And Alaska, number 5. And again, this kind of surprised me because Alaska doesn't have a whole lot of solar. You would think that they would, certainly, and perhaps some of this may just be a reporting thing. Maybe the only numbers that get reported are those that are connected to the grid. So if you do have standalone systems, they may go unnoticed as far as all of these statistical collections. Because I would imagine the very isolated nature of Alaska would be something that would lend itself to solar. Oh, somebody's mentioning, yeah, long, dark, cold winters. Yep. Well, but you get some sun in the summer for sure. Yeah, and I was surprised at the cost per watt for installation. I would have expected it to be much higher in Alaska. Then we get into Rhode Island, everybody's favorite state. That has extremely high electricity. So 31 cents a kilowatt hour there, and pretty high cost of installation, but we come in at 4.4 years. Then we get into Connecticut at number 3. And that again is because of the high cost of electricity. And then as had been projected, number 2 is going to be California. And California, this was based on retail. So we know that the net metering 3.0 substantially changed that a bit. So I would say that California may have dropped down a little bit because of the net metering 3.0 that took it from a retail payback or net metering to a wholesale. But that could be applying to other states as well. So I didn't factor that in here. And then when you see the cost of electricity in Hawaii, you'll see the cost of sunshine. So 44 cents per kilowatt hour. And I know that they have time of day pricing. So this is probably a blended rate, but it is the highest cost of electricity nationwide. And of course, the highest annual savings. So in a state like Hawaii, you're really looking at a post-incentive payback period of about 2.65 years. And of course, some of these states, like Hawaii and California, do have mandates for new construction that they must incorporate solar into the construction, and you can see why. It's quite a good payback, quite an easy payback. So then I thought it was interesting, or it would be interesting to just compare if we look at simple economics, do economics then play out? And I think to a very large extent they do. Our listing here, the top 10, Hawaii, number 1, California, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Alaska, I put these in red, the ones that don't transfer over to the actual, is for whatever reason, it should have good payback, but it's not showing up on the list. Massachusetts in there, Maine, New York, and New Hampshire. drop off that top 10 list in Vermont. Then the actual, and actually this was a statistic that was kind of hard to find. What I did is I simply put in the amount of residential or distributed energy in a state divided by the population. So it doesn't take into account utility scale. And we're trying not to get to where the bigger states like Texas, California, if you just took a grand total number. So I wanted it per person, per capita. So the actual is Hawaii, number one, the highest per capita by quite a measure. California, number two. Arizona pops up there, even though Arizona was not as economically viable. And I suspect that if we add in the amount of sunlight, it becomes more economically viable when you change that 4.5 hours of insolation to something like 6.2 or 6.3, which you probably get in many parts of Arizona. It bumps it up the list, maybe even into the top 10. Rhode Island is there, Massachusetts is there, and Vermont, some of those New England states. New Jersey, I think New Jersey has had traditionally some really good incentives, which probably put it up there. Nevada, that might be a sunshine thing as well. And Connecticut's in there, and then Minnesota. And I think Minnesota jumped in there largely because of community solar. Minnesota's been very aggressive on community solar, and that would show up as a distributed per capita, but not necessarily rooftop solar. All right, so that is kind of my recap of where we are on a state-by-state basis. Does anybody have anything? Pete, you've got a comment there?
Yeah, I see that Devin is on the call. Could you ask him what the situation is in Trinidad as far as cost per kilowatt hour and cost per watt installed?
Okay, I think you just asked him. Devin, do you have a comment about the island?
Yeah, it's kind of we don't really unfortunately have that kind of metrics like cost per kilowatt hour cost because first of all we don't have grid-tied systems in Trinidad yet, and most of our installations are battery based, and we do have a lot of variations in components. We Trinidadians order components across the globe, US, Europe, China. So there's a big variation in, let's say, a 10 kilowatt system in terms of what it is. But I would say, like, if I do like a 10 kilowatt system, TT dollars, that would probably be like about roughly $1,000 TT per kilowatt. So we cannot use it like that. But of course, it is still subjected to site visits because there can be a lot of variations in a similar size system, as you all know, G. Putting a system on a flat roof is different than putting a system on a 3-story building. So the labor cost will definitely change, as well as the materials costing of that.
What are you guys paying anywhere close to the 11 cents that they're talking about as far as a global cost of solar panels per watt?
Well, all right. So we buy panels from we buy panels from across the globe, but Trinidadians tend to buy most of their PV modules that is Chinese branded. And so I know 12 cents, 14, even 16 cents a watt. We tend to go down even at that price range. Most contractors in Trinidad will ship a container across, 20-foot or 40-foot container. And they will buy from companies like Jinko, Trina, Longji. We're offering very low price per watt. As I say, sometimes 14 cents, 16 cents per watt, as opposed to bringing PV modules from Europe or even in USA, which would put it over the 20-something cents per watt in those cases. So it is a very competitive market in Trinidad at the moment. Everybody is trying to see where they get the best pricing. Once the PV modules meet local standards, the UL or IEC standards, they don't really care where the panels come from. At the end, it is about where they get the best price cost from. Yeah.
Have they made any changes to the to the regulations where you can hook up your systems to the grid, or are these things still prohibited from being hooked to the grid?
No, there have been provisions made. So there are currently many grid interconnected systems in Trinidad. Feed-in tariff policies haven't been set yet. So all grid connected systems have to be based on zero export, self-consumption. They treat it at the moment on a case-by-case basis in terms of licensing and permitting.
Okay. And somebody just asked in the chat, do you know what the average per watt or per kilowatt hour cost of electricity from the grid is in Trinidad and Tobago?
Roughly is about 25 cents TT. I think it would work out to about 6 cents or 7 cents US cents per kilowatt hour.
Really? Okay.
Yeah,
So
it's very, very, very cheap. Very, 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 very cheap.
it must be subsidized by the government then. I
It
would
is subsidized,
imagine.
yes.
Yeah.
And therein lies the problem, because when we look at PV systems for the residential market, they ask the questions on ROIs and payback time, and especially most people do battery based. You're not looking at any 3 years or 5 years. You could be looking at 20-something, 30-something years plus, which kind of discourage a lot of people. But the larger commercial installations in Trinidad, which are more engaged in corporation banks, they doing it on a 100 kilowatt, 200, 300 kilowatt system. They do see some benefits for them, because on top of that utility rate, a lot of these larger bodies have maximum demand charges to pay. And what the utility company in Trinidad is saying is that if they can show evidence over, let's say, a 6 months period, that they are actually consuming less energy, they could come in and revisit the maximum demand charge and reduce it. So with that, and I know with the 100, 200,000 TT dollars a month, obviously they're looking to see where they could cut costs.
Yep. Yeah, speaking of demand charges, since we have just a minute here, has anybody who's on the call been dealing with utilities that are getting crazy with demand charges? I know I've had a couple of those situations here recently. It feels like the utilities continually are trying to find ways to make solar, or to attempt to make solar, less and less attractive. And as a result, I feel like many people are getting fed up with the utilities for sure. And they're just saying, listen, as soon as these batteries get to a certain stage, I'm just going to cut the cord and go independent and not bother connecting to the utility. So does anybody have an example of something that they've been dealing with as far as demand charges?
I mean, in commercial, it is pretty common to have demand charges on there. It's hard to predict or replace them with solar, unless you do battery set. But in commercial, it's almost always demand charges on there. And I'm not in sales, so I don't know how they handle that. But
well, I was just looking at there's a church that we're affiliated with, and they have a solar array on their roof, and their demand, it's not like they're running heavy equipment. You know, the demands from their system never exceed 200 amps. I mean, whatever the normal 200 amp service for their building, they don't have those kind of loads. So it's not like the utility has to put in any kind of special infrastructure. But what they've been doing is they've been charging them demand charges on not only the power that they're consuming, but also the power that they're feeding back to the grid. They're charging them the transmission and the distribution fees for those. So they're basically double dipping, where they're charging the distribution and transmission fees for the next door neighbor who's consuming the electricity as well, but then they're charging the church for it. So they're getting paid twice to distribute that power 15 feet from one building to the next. So it's a very, I guess what I should talk about here just really quickly is that in the world of utilities, your bill typically, even on a residential, has transmission charges, distribution charges, and generation charges. The generation is to produce the power. The transmission is to take it from the power plant to the substation, essentially. And then the distribution charges to take it from the substation to the end user, to the home or to the business. So discounting demand charges, which we were just talking about, that's kind of what you're seeing when you see these three different charges. Well, if I sell power, or if I net meter back to my utility, the power that I'm sending back on the grid goes from my building to the next load. So that's going to go to the building directly adjacent. In theory, there are no distribution charges and there are no transmission charges that are associated with that power, because it's not going from a power plant. It's not going over those long things. It's not going through their distribution system to any extent, really. So fine, if you want to charge my next door neighbor the traditional costs, that's one thing, but then don't charge me as well for those transmission and distribution charges to put that power back onto the grid. So that's one issue. And then, of course, the demand charges. The demand charges are something that in commercial, they charge for the 15-minute period where you're using the most power. And the argument from the utility is we have to provide the infrastructure to give you the maximum amount of power that you're drawing, whether you're drawing it for 15 minutes or whether you're drawing it 24/7. That infrastructure still has to be there, therefore we're going to charge you for it. My argument to the utility is if that demand charge never exceeds what the minimum infrastructure you need to provide service to that building, then there should be no demand charges because there is no increased cost for infrastructure. So those are a couple of arguments that are going to fall on deaf ears forever. So that will be my rant on that. Any comments on that or anything else you want to bring up? Yeah.
Robert here. In Kansas, we fought demand fees because the utility company forced anybody who got solar into a demand plan, which was based on the highest 15 minutes, $9 per kilowatt in the summer and $3 per kilowatt in the winter. It would add like $45 to the average bill, although since there's a discount for the volumetric charges, some people would have been okay. Large arrays and large users would have been okay. But anyway, we fought it. It fell on deaf ears until the Sierra Club and Earth Justice and a local lawyer from Lawrence, Kansas, Babai, took the KCC, the Kansas Corporation Commission, and the utility company Evergy to court and won. Based on a 1980 law that said you can't charge more for renewable energy. It maybe was a bit of a technicality because the law, the judge said, the Chief Justice said of the Kansas Supreme Court said, if they intended to charge more, I wish they would have said so. But since they didn't say, they said they couldn't charge. They could charge differently, but in a more recent law. So there were two laws. One in 1980 that said you can't charge more. Then there was another law that they got through in 2014 that said you can charge more, you can charge differently. But the Supreme Court said, well, you can charge differently, but you can't charge more, and demand fees definitely add more. So yes, it is a trick that utility companies use to try to discourage solar by forcing them into a demand plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's frustrating. I think the net result of this, of course, is to the utilities. It really is not to their benefit. They should be embracing this and trying to figure out how they can be profitable under this scenario. Instead, they're kind of doing this knee-jerk reaction. How can we maximize short-term gains? We're probably going to see more and more people opting out of being connected to the utility just because economically they're going to make it uneconomic to connect in. Anybody else have any comments before we call it a day? All right. Okay, well, hearing none, I thank everybody for your attention, and we'll see you all again next week. All right, take care.
Thank you.